So this is part 5 of the Platonic dialogue, Cratylus. Thus far, we've been talking about the etymology of words. Rather, I should say this is the basis of the dialogue. Currently, we have been having a conversation between Socrates and Cratylus. And Cratylus has a particular view about the correctness of names. He has a very mathematical, logical approach to naming things. He says that if something is added or subtracted to a name, it no longer is the name, it no longer represents the thing that is doing the naming, let's say, or that has some representation of the thing that it names. And Socrates' rebuttal to this is that we have to remember that names are like images. They are representations of reality. They are not reality itself. And so therefore we cannot have the same standard, for our names can never truly approach the totality of reality, for if they did, they would be reality itself. So an example, he gives examples of the painter. If we paint an image to represent something, we may add or remove things, whether they be large or small, and still have the image that represents what we wish it to represent. That is not to say that if we added something overly significant to the nature of the image, or subtracted something, that then this wouldn't either improve it or completely take away from its meaning. There certainly would be a case, there would be a point, a threshold, at which the image no longer represents the thing that is intending to reflect. But again, the main point here of the rebuttal by Socrates is to tell Cratylus that it is not purely mathematical. Again, if it were truly to represent reality, then it would be reality itself. And then he gives another example, saying, suppose that there were a Cratylus and an image of Cratylus in the following circumstance. He says, suppose some god didn't just repeat your color and shape the way painters do, but made all the inner parts like yours, with the same warmth and softness, and put motion, soul, and wisdom like yours into them. In a word, suppose he made a duplicate of everything you have and put it beside you. Would there then be two Cratyluses, or Cratylus and an image of Cratylus? Now Cratylus responds to this by saying, it seems to me, Socrates, that there would be two Cratyluses, thereby conceding his argument. And so Socrates follows by saying, so don't you see that we must look for some other kind of correctness in images and in the names we've been discussing, and not insist that if a detail is added to an image or omitted from it, it's no longer an image at all? Or haven't you noticed how far images are from having the same features as the things of which they are images? And Cratylus says, yes, I have. Now, I think this altogether gets into a more delicate conversation, an interesting conversation, and it's one that we had earlier on in this dialogue, before Socrates went into the describing the various names and their potential origins, what they mean, what they meant in the ancient Greek. When we began, or near the beginning of this dialogue, we had some profound insights into the nature of our social organization. We had dialogue that was relating, in some sense, our experience and our ability to perceive with the reality that is around us. Some of this has to do with our ability, our capacity for resolution, because the human being although quite imperfect, has various organs, sense organs, that allows it to take in information from the environment and incorporate it into a larger collective of neurons, and these scale to a point where the emergence of the phenomena that comes about through the interaction of the particular elements, the fundamental elements, which we could just as easily say the bedrock of our known reality, truly the fundamental pieces, our protons, our neutrons, and a subatomic level, to the neurons, which are quite basic in terms of processing and function when compared to the totality of the human mind. And then you have the totality of the thing itself, which seems to transcend each of the individual elements. It is beyond the being of its constituent parts. But of course, it is necessary to its being to have those fundamental elements. And just as we discussed with the gray area that surrounds this relativistic imaging, there is a fundamental center. There's a center by which our images that we produce and the sounds that we produce, that surrounds a fundamental core of reality. And I think it is a matter of, I don't really want to say perception, but it's a matter of mind. I say that loosely, just for the context of the human being. It is a matter of mind that the images and the sounds and whatever other inputs that either we create or that we consume are but a piece of the totality of reality. In front of me there are various objects, and I feel like I could see them. I feel like I know them. I could touch them. I could smell them if I wanted to. And even all of that, and all of my observation, just sitting here looking at it, I know from my understanding of the material reality that there is more than meets the eye regarding to the keyboard that sits in front of me, for example, or the microphone that I talk into. And from this observation, I think it's interesting to reflect on how we put together what reality is, especially since we don't have all of the available information. And surely we have enough of the information to do things that are meaningful to us, whether it be from the discipline of discovering what is meaningful in general to the design of material objects, like I said with the keyboard or the microphone that's in front of me, to our social relationships. And so, I think in some sense, the etymology of words is as much an exercise in categorizing and making sense of reality, giving it a sort of an auditory description that we can utilize within our memory to make it easier, like a tool within our tool belt, to make it easier to make sense of this reality, to use a greater degree of our mental processing to understand reality. Language is certainly a benefit to humanity. We are able to properly categorize and integrate one another into these social collectives. We do this by sharing a similar sense of reality. Now, there is certainly a base sense of reality that we all share by virtue of our the homogeneity of our sensory organs, and we don't need language to come together and to love one another, but it's certainly a helpful, useful tool. Now, I'd like to add a commentary here by Socrates after he had sort of convinced Cratylus of the incompleteness of names, sort of by their nature. Incompleteness, but still retaining information that allows us to know what it is representing, thereby being an image or a name. He says, "Things are still named and described when this happens," referring to the addition of incompleteness, right? An appropriate letter or an inappropriate phrase, provided the phrases include the patterns of the things they are about. Remember that this is just what Hermogenes and I claimed earlier about the names of the elements. So the key here is that the statement, provided the phrases include the pattern of the things they're about. And so there is a recognition of a pattern of something. And that this pattern is the thing that we pick up on. This pattern is the thing that we choose to image, whether it be in our painting, in our art, our communication, through speech. And of course, it's not just art. By the way, we can image things. You see images all over the place in society. Just walk outside and see how many different images there are. Whether it be the various road signs, to the stoplights, to the various businesses, they're everywhere. And if we take a specific example, let's say a business, even more specifically, let's say a restaurant. When we drive by it, or we walk by it, we see the name of the establishment, and we can tell that it is a restaurant. Perhaps by its location, by its name, by perhaps what we can smell, by what we can see. And within the restaurant, so the restaurant, it symbolizes many different things. The name of that restaurant symbolizes many different things. But we go there to eat. We go there for enjoyment. We go there for different reasons. For socializing. The main point of the restaurant is to provide us with food. Food that can nourish us. And the way we get there, the road by which we take to get there, is steeped in the various signs that cue us into this is a place where you can sit down and have a meal, and thereby sustain yourself, thereby come in contact with somebody that you care about, to socialize with somebody, make a connection with somebody. Maybe it's a business-related event, whatever the case might be. They're all things to guide us. And again, in the case of the restaurant, to guide us to what is the fundamental point of this establishment, of all of these signs, of all of the design in the room, the position of the chairs, the layout of the restaurant. So let's continue. Socrates says, good. So even if a name doesn't include all the appropriate letters, it will still describe the thing if it includes its pattern, though it will describe the thing well if it includes all the appropriate letters, and badly if it includes few of them. I think we had better accept this, Cratylus, or else, like men lost on the streets of Aegina late at night, we too may incur the charge of truly seeming to be the sort of people who arrive at things later than they should. For if you deny it, you cannot agree that a name is correct if it expresses things by means of letters and syllables, and you'll have to search for some other account of the correctness of names. Since if you both deny it and accept this account of correctness, you'll contradict yourself. Cratylus says, you seem to me to be speaking reasonably, Socrates, and I take what you have said as established. Well then, since we agree about that, let's consider the next point. If a name is well given, don't we say that it must have appropriate letters? Now this is one of the fundamental things in my mind, because what I still don't understand is how these letters can be put together to form something that is meaningful to us. What is it about the fundamental quality of the letters, the fundamental elements, that then eventually build into something that is meaningful? Because it is about the letters. Because if there were no letters, then there would be no words. Is it the case that at a certain point, the meaning just pops into existence once certain letters are arranged in a certain way? Now, I don't mean here to imply that if it's arranged in a certain way, then it's intelligible across the world, because there are different languages. There are infants and adolescents that go through the process of learning language, and if they do not do that, they can be severely inhibited in terms of their potential for learning language in general after a certain point. So I understand that language is not an intuitive thing to the human being, like seeing or hearing or being able to tell where their head is in space. But by the same token, it is something that a word is something that is built from something that is more fundamental, just as a house is built of fundamental supports. We may not see these supports at the end result, but without the frame and the skeleton, there's really nothing to hold that house up or give it its character. And it may be well the case that the human beings apply the meaning to the words, just as we apply the meaning to what a house is. But again, we also must, at a certain point, apply meaning to the fundamental characteristics in order to reach the meaning at the end, where the whole is something that is meaningful to us, the whole greater than that of the individual elements. Because certainly we would say one brick on a house doesn't make a house, but it is an element that makes the house. And so what is it about this brick, about its quality, just like a particular letter, that contributes to the meaning of the house or of the word? And I think of the brick, at the very least we could say that the brick is something that is designed by the human being for some other purpose. So just as the house is designed in such a way for the purpose of the human being, to provide him with shelter and safety and so on, the brick of the house is designed for that end, is designed for building. It has a particular structure that is useful for the end of building. It is useful for the building of the thing itself, and the thing itself may have a variety of purposes, whether it be a home or a building for a restaurant. The building itself houses something greater. Again, whether it be a restaurant, whether it be a gas station, whether it be a home. And I think just in this way, the letters are sort of the building blocks of the words. And a brick can be seen as a particular letter. There are many different types of building materials, many different ways in which we can arrange something, materials together to produce a building, just as there are many different letters that we can use to arrange a particular word. And just as there are many different types of buildings, there are many different types of words. And so we should not, I think, make the mistake that the brick is, how would we say, in some ways intuitive, or maybe intuitive is not the right word, but in some sense it encapsulates a particular meaning by which there's something greater to be uncovered that would tell us more than the word about the nature of reality than the word itself. I think this would be a mistake because the fundamental characteristic of the brick or of the letter is to guide us to the greater meaning. And how we choose to use those building blocks are up to us. But the way that we arrange them is very important. These are our structural supports for our intelligibility, of our meaning making. As the letters are the building blocks of the tools that we use to interpret reality. And language itself is a tool that we use to interpret reality, to create images. So again, Socrates says, well then, since we agree about that, let's consider the next point. If a name is well given, don't we say that it must have appropriate letters? Cratylus agrees. Socrates, and then appropriate letters are the ones that are like the things. Now Cratylus says certainly. So now this appropriateness of letters, I think, is interesting. When Socrates says, and the appropriate letters are the ones that are like the things. And again, to my earlier point, I think we have to be careful not to get too carried away about these letters, or the appropriateness of these letters. There is an appropriateness, because if you design a brick, you make a brick, and then throw it into a pond, that's not going to do anything for the design of your building, or the design of whatever it is that you're going to use that material to build something from. Therefore, That's the way that well-given names are given. But if a name isn't well given, it's probable that that most of its letters are appropriate. Let me reread that. Therefore, that's the way that well-given names are given. But if a name isn't well given, it's probable that most of its letters are appropriate or like the thing it names, if indeed it is a likeness of it, but that some are inappropriate and prevent the name from being good or well given. Is that our view, or is it something different? Cratylus says, I don't suppose there's anything to be gained by continuing to quarrel, Socrates, but I'm not satisfied that something is a name if it isn't well given. And I think this is a good point here by Cratylus, because, again, expanding this representation, or this dialogue, out into our discussion about a building, we may say, we may have a bunch of different material organized together, and at some point it becomes the thing that we intend it to become. Let's say we intend it to become a car wash. Now that's a pretty complicated example. That's more complicated than a home or a house or shelter, let's say. But just because, well, maybe I'll say this. So we have our bricks oriented, and we have a building. Is it a car wash? It can't be a car wash yet. Okay, so we provide it with a connection to pressurized water. So now that it has flow of water to it, but it has no hoses, it has no machines by which to wash cars. Now, there are different types of car washes. There can be a service by which the people do the majority of the work. And if this is the case, all they really need is the hookup of water. And the company can provide the individuals with the cleaning materials, whether it be the soap or the buckets and the rags, whatever. Or it could have the machines that make it more automated. But regardless of the nature of the car wash, at some point the car wash becomes a car wash and moves beyond just a building. And likewise, there must be at some point by which it is considered to be a building, beyond which point it is a loose collection of just building materials. I think of, for example, either a derelict building or a bombed out building that you might see in like a World War II photograph. There's a certain salvageability to a building once it has been impacted in that way. And also there's a certain point by which you may have a derelict building or a bombed out building that only has a wall remaining. But that's not a building. Certainly it uses more sophisticated building materials that have been designed. There has been human ingenuity built into it. And there's a degree of organization there that still remains in the form of a wall, but it is not its building. So to Cratylus' point here, there is indeed a point by which the fundamental building materials reach a sufficient mass to produce, or to be considered by its nature, a building, or in the case of words, the letters that then produce a word. And so I think in a broader sense what this means is that there is truth. And what surrounds this truth is its representation, And if we go too far away from that truth, its representation is too vague or entirely nonsensical so as to no longer represent the truth of the thing that is, or that it is trying to represent. But the problem here is not so much this representation. The argument is the wellness of the name. And so the question is, well then, what is a well-given name? Certainly a well-given name is always going to point to the thing that is, which means it cannot be far out away from this thing that is, for if it was, then it would be quite difficult to ascertain. And I would say even within the distinction of what we would consider to be a well-given name, you can still have the word relatively pointing to the thing that is, but also be sufficiently far away from the thing that is to produce confusion, and this would be considered probably not a well-given name by nature of its proximity, distance away from the thing that is. And Socrates says, but you are satisfied that a name is a way of expressing a thing. And Cratylus says, I am. So this is still a continuation of Cratylus' thought, because he has made the submission that even though the names aren't perfect representations of reality, they cannot perfectly map 100%. He does still agree with this, but he's caught up now within the wellness of the name. Socrates, and do you think it's true that some names are composed out of more primitive ones, while others are primary? Cratylus says, yes, I do. So here we have a new level, a new layer. Where the more primary names would be more of the fundamental building blocks. This would be a building as opposed to a restaurant, right? Because a restaurant requires a building for its being, but a building isn't necessarily a restaurant. But if the primary names are to be ways of expressing things clearly, is there any better way of getting them to be such than by making each of them as much like the thing it is to express as possible? Or do you prefer the way proposed by Hermogenes and many others, who claim that the names are conventional signs that express things to those who already knew the things before they established the conventions? Do you think that the correctness of names is conventional, so that it makes no difference whether we accept the present convention or adopt the opposite one? Calling big what we now call small, and small what we now call big. Which of these two ways of getting names to express things do you prefer? Now Socrates raises a very deep question here. He says, but if the primary names are to be ways of expressing things clearly, is there any better way of getting them to be such than by making each of them as like the thing it is to express as possible? Perhaps it's not the deepest question after some reflection, but it certainly depends on where you approach it. Now, primary names are important. They're fundamental names. And they do extend quite deep into the understanding and the meaning of things. For if everything was relative, then we would run into this issue of understanding one another, the issue of understanding the self without established conventional norms. Or do you prefer the way proposed by Hermogenes and many others, who claim that names are conventional signs that express things to those who already knew the things before they established the conventions? Do you think that the correctness of names is conventional, so that it makes no difference whether we accept the present convention or adopt the opposite one, calling big what we now call small, and small what we now call big? Which of these two ways of getting names to express things do you prefer? Sometimes it's nice to go over things a few times. It's nice to go through things a few times because it solidifies what you've read. New things begin to pop out at you after reading it the second time. And it's interesting, this type of language. I can't help but to consider the recent experience of the Western world and this explanation of subjectivism in terms of the meaning of words. The meaning of something does not regard convention. It regards nothing but the individual and what he knows to be true. Now we may in one sense call this subjective. But it is also a type of arrogance. It's a totalitarianism of the individual, by the individual, locking the world and everything else, everybody else, out of it, except for their own experience. Now, Cratylus says, a name that expresses a thing by being like it is in every way superior, Socrates, to the one that is given by chance. Now, Socrates says that's right. But if a name is indeed to be like a thing, mustn't the letters or elements out of which primary names are composed be naturally like things? Let me explain by returning to our earlier analogy with painting. Could a painting ever be made like any of the things that are, if it were not composed of pigments that were by nature like the things that the art of painting imitates? Isn't that impossible? And Cratylus says, yes, it's impossible. Then by the same token, can names ever be like anything, unless the things they're composed out of have some kind of likeness to the things they imitate? And aren't they composed of letters or elements? Yes. Now, consider what I said to Hermogenes earlier. Tell me, do you think it was right to say that R is like motion, moving, and hardness, or not? Cratylus says you were right. And L is like the smoothness, or like smoothness, softness, and the other things we mentioned. Cratylus says yes. Yet, you know that the very thing that we call sclerotes, hardness, is called scleroter by the Etruscans. Cratylus says certainly. Then are both R and S like the same thing? And does the name ending in R express the same thing to them as the one ending in S does to us? Or does one of them fail to express it? Now Cratylus says they both express it. Insofar as R and S are alike, or insofar as they are unlike? Cratylus says, insofar that they are alike. Socrates says, are they alike in all respects? Cratylus says they are presumably alike with respect to expressing motion, at any rate. What about the L in these names? Doesn't it express the opposite of hardness? Perhaps it is incorrectly included in them. Socrates. Maybe it's just like the examples you cited to Hermogenes a while ago, in which you added or subtracted letters. You are correct to do so, in my view. So, too, in the present case, perhaps we ought to replace L with R. Socrates says you have a point. But what about when somebody says scleron, hard, and pronounces it the way we do at present? Don't we understand him? Don't you yourself know what I mean by it? Cratylus says I do, but that's because of usage. Socrates, when you say usage, do you mean something other than convention? Do you mean something by usage besides, when I utter this name and mean hardness by it, you know that it is what I mean? Isn't that what you're saying? Cratylus says yes. Now it's interesting, this conclusion that we have drawn from our earlier statement. When we had our two possibilities, or two hypotheses, we said, are the names relative by convention, or is there something else about the name? That is, the name, there's something fundamental about the name that represents something fundamental about the object. And what better way for a name to represent a thing fundamentally than to have an auditory expression that seems to image that which we would like to illustrate or convey. And so we now talk about a few different letters that have similar characteristics, something that I'll admit that I have not thought of, about the various letters and what do I think like they sound like in relation to nature. I wonder what happens the less we are connected to the natural world, and the more we are connected to the human world, the artificial world that we have created, especially the internet, but also within our large cities and our large modern conveniences, large-scale modern conveniences. One has to wonder what this does to language, if anything. Perhaps it does nothing at all. Perhaps language adapts well to it. I don't know, but anyway, to return to the point, there are letters that seem to represent certain aspects of our reality that are constant. There are sounds that we could stimulate with our mouth, or we could produce with our mouths, that again mimics our reality. And yet there is variability. And so what can we do about this variability? We can have two letters, two completely different sounds that seemingly represent a similar aspect about our reality. Now this may be easy enough, as Socrates and Cratylus seem to agree that they both can express similar things. But an issue arises when we discuss not just the R and the S, but also the L. The R is like motion, moving, and hardness. The L is like smoothness and softness, seemingly the opposite of the R. And yet, in the word sclerator, we have both letters used in the same word. You have S and two R's, one L. Three elements of this hardness, one element of the softness. And so what can we do about this opposite? Why are they together? If it truly is to be that the fundamental elements have some relationship to reality, that it's not just convention, that they mimic something particular. Now, Cratylus suggests that this is perhaps a mistake. It's incorrectly included in them, talking about the letter L. Perhaps it's just like the examples that Socrates cited with Hermogenes, that the extra letter, this L, was added for euphony, just for the pure way that it sounds, for the elegance of its sounding. Socrates agrees that Cratylus has a point. And then he uses another word, but similar, scleron, or hard, and pronounces it the way we do at present. Don't we understand him? Don't you understand? Don't you know yourself? Don't you yourself know what I mean by it? Cratylus says, I do, but that's because of usage. So what can we say about this new word? We haven't replaced the L, and we still have the S, and we still have the R. We've removed the T, but it's quite similar. Now, Cratylus says he understands what we mean by it because of usage. And so usage, to Socrates, seems to imply convention, because it is by convention in that case. Or perhaps I should say it's by common usage. It's by the established usage, the unofficially established usage, that nobody seems to question. It just is as it is. Socrates asks, well, do you mean that it is by convention or something else? He says, besides, when I utter this name and mean hardness by it, you know that this is what I mean. Isn't that what you're saying? Cratylus says, yes. And if I utter a name, you know what I mean. Doesn't that name become a way for me to express it to you? Cratylus says, yes. And so Socrates says, even though the name I utter is unlike the thing I mean, since L is unlike hardness, to revert to your example. But if that's right, surely you have entered into a convention with yourself, and the correctness of names has become a matter of convention for you, for isn't the chance of usage and convention that makes both like and unlike letters express things? And even if usage is completely different from convention, still you must say that expressing something isn't a matter of likeness, but of usage, since usage, it seems, enables both like and unlike names to express things. Since we agree on these points, Cratylus, for I take your silence as a sign of agreement, both convention and usage must contribute to something, to expressing what we mean when we speak. Consider numbers. Cratylus. Since you want to have recourse with them, where do you think you'll get names that are like one of the numbers? If you don't allow this agreement and convention of yours to have some control over the correctness of names. I myself prefer the view that names should be as much like things as possible, but I fear that defending this view is like hauling a ship up a sticky ramp, as Hermogenes suggested, and that we have to make use of this worthless thing, convention, in the correctness of names, for probably the best way to speak consists in using names, all or most of which are likely the things they name, that is, are appropriate to them, while the worst is to use the opposite kind of names. But let me ask you this. What power do names have for us? What's the good to them? So here we have an interesting concession by Cratylus and Socrates. It would seem that they would prefer to have names completely named after the things that they represent, or have the names accurately represent the things that they name. But it seems to be the case that convention, although an undesirable thing, is, in large part, how names and things are connected. And this is held together not only by the individual agreeing to it, but also the collective agreeing to it. And you ask, what power do names have for us? What's the good of them? Now, this is something that we have discussed before, and so it'll be interesting to see what they have to say. Cratylus says, to give instruction, Socrates. After all, the simple truth is that anyone who knows a thing's name also knows the thing. Perhaps you mean this, Cratylus, that when you know what a name is like, and it is like the thing it names, then you also know the thing, since it is like the name. And all like things fall under one and the same craft. Isn't that why you say that whoever knows a thing's name also knows the thing? And remember what they said earlier about this knowing. It is to be in motion with the way of things. It's a type of paralleled existing. Difficult to describe what exactly knowing is. But if I am going to say that something is parallel to something else, certainly it not only mirrors it, perhaps, it wouldn't mirror it completely, but it follows a similar characteristic. And this is enough for it to perhaps be recognized and to hold some weight in the mind, that so it can be differentiated from other things, that it could be placed within our memory as a thing apart from other things. It's quite a powerful thing. And so to know the name is to know the thing, because to know the name is a parallel of the thing. Now, from this example, I think it seems clear to me that knowing the name of something is not everything. because the name of something is just one image that we can produce. There are many other aspects, many other perspectives that we can take on viewing a thing. Its name is just one of those. Now, classic Socrates, he seems to expand the thought into something that Cratylus had not really said. But he says, perhaps you mean this, Cratylus, that when you know what a name is like, and it is like the thing it names. So here he's saying, when you know what a name is like, and it is like the thing it names, then you also know the thing, since it is like the name. And all like things fall under one and the same craft. Isn't that why you say that whoever knows the thing's name also knows the thing? Now perhaps I should have said that Socrates is saying more or less what Cratylus said, just adding perhaps onto it. When you know what a name is like, and it is like the thing it names. So again, we run into the issue of knowing what the name is like. So we have this component, again, of the fundamental elements of letters, let's say. And we know the thing and its relation to its name. We say it's a good name. It's still possible to have something, the name of something that really doesn't match what the thing is. Perhaps that can be something, but not completely solely tied to convention. Cratylus says, yes, you're absolutely right. Socrates, then let's look at that way of giving instruction about the things that are. Is there also another one, but inferior to this? Or is it the only one? What do you think? Cratylus says, I think that it is the best and only way, and that there are no others. And Socrates says, is it also the best way to discover the things that are? If one discovers something's name, does one also discover the thing it names? Or are names only a way of getting people to learn things, and must investigation and discovery be undertaken in some different way? Cratylus, they must certainly be undertaken in exactly the same way, and by means of the same things. Socrates says, but don't you see, Cratylus, that anyone who investigates things by taking names as his guides and looking into their meanings runs no small risk of being deceived? In what way? It's clear that the first name giver gave names to things based on his conception of what those things were like. Isn't that right? Cratylus says, yes. And if his conception was incorrect, and he gave names based on it, what do you suppose will happen to us if we take him as our guide? Won't we be deceived? Cratylus says, but it wasn't that way, Socrates. The name-giver had to know the things he was naming. Otherwise, as I've been saying all along, his names wouldn't be names at all. And here's a powerful proof for you that the name-giver didn't miss the truth. His names are entirely consistent with one another. Or haven't you noticed that all the names you utter are based on the same assumption and have the same purpose? Socrates says, but surely that's no defense, Cratylus. The name-giver might have made a mistake at the beginning and then force the other names to be consistent with it. There would be nothing strange in that. Geometrical constructions often have a small unnoticed error at the beginning, with which all the rest is perfectly consistent. That's why every man must think a lot about the first principles of anything and investigate them thoroughly to see whether or not it's correct to assume from. For if they have been inadequately, or if they have been adequately examined, the subsequent steps will plainly follow from them. However, I'd be surprised if names are actually consistent with one another. So let's review our earlier discussion. We said that names signify the being or essence of things to us, on the assumption that all things are moving and flowing and being swept along. Isn't that what you think the names express? Cratylus says absolutely. Moreover, I think they signify correctly. Now, I think we have had the thought here that Socrates mentions when he says, but don't you see, Cratylus, that anyone who investigates things by taking names as his guides and looking into their meanings runs no small risk of being deceived? In other words, that there is quite a risk in being deceived by taking the names as their guides. Because although convention is involved here, and that there's an agreed understanding, and although the individual can, if he so chooses, question the origin of the word that he speaks, nonetheless, much of the time, the words are not questioned. We run with them as we hear them. We know them as we are taught them. And these guides, these images of reality, this auditory expression that is to give us the conscious framework, perhaps, by which to place loftier thoughts upon, to rest our loftier senses, a sense of being, this longing, love, what is beautiful, and the things that are seemingly quite difficult to pinpoint exactly what about these things is true. I think that the naming of something, just like a painting, is limited by its very craft. Now, it's not to say that because it is limited by its craft, then it's not worthwhile, that language is not worthwhile. Of course, that's not what I'm saying. But to put all our cards in one basket, or put all our eggs in one basket, it's always dangerous. That's why it's a saying, it's a principle. Because there is danger, just as there is danger in interpreting the entirety of one's reality through a painting that is represented by another. Now again, we've had conversations about, well, perhaps it's all relative to the individual, this meaning and this naming, and that it can change the meaning of this word from one thing to another. And certainly, in the case of Socrates and Hermogenes' earlier discussion, we've had a case in which I think one of the names of the gods was changed from something that was to something completely different, almost nearing its opposite. And so here we have a bunch of different elements in this conversation. We have this strong reasoned approach, how we would wish that our language was. That is to say, that of the fundamental elements that seem to mimic what we observe in our reality should be the things that make up and constitute our words and our names. However, there is a significant conventional component otherwise known as the agreed upon, the social interplay that allows for the evolution of language. Perhaps as people grow, as cultures grow, as societies grow, whatever. But that doesn't save us from the potential of profound confusion and a state in which the society seemingly goes mad, the names seem to lose their grasp on reality. I think this is one way this deceit can come about, is mass psychosis. We're no strangers to it in our modern day. And yet, it's not a denial of any one of these things. All of these things seem to be part of our experience. Nonetheless, our language is, and our words are, modes of expression to categorize and interpret our reality. So now Socrates brings up the case. So we have our language. Okay, the fundamental elements, some of our reasoning is there. Certainly, in the beginning, there must have been some thought to how the word sounds, to the actual nature of the thing that it is intended to describe. And yet, through the various examples that we have some of the letters that we would think that seem to represent what the word describes, but also letters that we would think opposite to that of the word's meaning are included in the word. And this is difficult for us to rationalize. This is the conventional component. There's no rhyme or reason to it. And so now we are in this unfortunate state where we have this agreed upon convention. It works, right? It is something that we can still come to know things. We can articulate and communicate with one another. This is not much of a problem. But the potential dangers are always at the doorstep of something that is not completely tethered to a thing. And I was about to say a thing's motion, because up until this point we have been discussing a fundamental interpretation of reality. It's a philosophical take on the way that things are. And it had to do, if we recall, in earlier episodes we were talking about the motion of things. That the fastest and the smallest of things is the thing that penetrates everything. And it's this motion that is sort of the unification of all motion, perhaps. It is this, I wouldn't necessarily say that this motion is 100% what we would consider motion to be in the physical sense, in the Enlightenment scientific sense. As in the case of distance, speed, acceleration, again, the more physical interpretation. Motion here is more broad. It does probably include that, but also more of a flow, which includes the being of man. And this is wound up in his ways of knowing and understanding, and ultimately accumulating into wisdom. So Socrates is now concerned about the accuracy of his initial assumptions. Or perhaps it wasn't his assumptions, this is where he traced the etymology of particular words. What he's now doing is questioning the rule setters. For it's possible that they were wrong, that they didn't interpret things correctly. He said, names signify the being or essence of things to us on the assumption that all things are moving and flowing and being swept along. Isn't that what you think names expressed? Cratylus agrees. Socrates continues and he says, of those we discussed, Let's reconsider the name episteme, or knowledge, first, and see how ambiguous it is. It seems to signify that it stops histei, or histesi, histesi, the movement of our soul towards epi, things, rather than that it accomplishes them in their movement, so that it's more correct to pronounce the beginning of it as we now do than insert an e and get episteme, or rather to insert an I instead of an E. Next, consider bebeion, or certain, which is an imitation of being based or basis on resting, stasis, not of motion. Historia, or inquiry, which is somewhat the same, signifies the stopping, or histesi, of the flow, ros. Piston, confidence, too, certainly signifies stopping, or histon. Next, anyone can see that neme, or memory, means the staying, or mone, in the soul, not emotion. Or consider hamartia, error, and symphora, mishap, if you like. If we take names as our guides, they seem to signify the names as synesis, comprehension, and episteme, knowledge, and other names of excellent things. Moreover, amathia, ignorance, and okalasia, licentiousness, also seem to be closely akin to them. For amathia seems to me the journey of someone who accompanies God, and akalesia seems precisely to mean movement guided by things. Thus names of what we consider to be the very worst things seem to be exactly like those of the very best. And if one took the trouble, I think one could find many other names, from which one could conclude that the name-giver intended to signify not that things were moving, but being swept along, but the opposite, that they were at rest. Cratylus says, but observe, Socrates, that most of them signify motion. Socrates says, what if they do, Cratylus? Are we to count names like boats, and determine their correctness that way? If more names signify motion, does that make them the true ones? Cratylus said, no, that's not a reasonable view. It certainly isn't, Cratylus. So let's drop this topic and return to the one that led us here. A little while ago you said, if you remember, that the name-giver had to know the things he named. Do you still believe that or not? Cratylus says, I do. Do you think that the giver of the first names also knew the things he named? Yes, he did know them. What names did he learn or discover those things from? After all, the first names had not yet been given. Yet it's impossible, on our view, to learn or discover things except by learning their names from others or discovering them ourselves. And so what can we say here about what Socrates means? So we have a series of words that seem to be contradictory to the assumption that that the good things flow, they move, they sweep things along. Socrates discusses that there are proper ways to name words more so than how they were spoken, if one is to name things completely reasonably for this fundamental idea surrounding this motion. He brings in contradictory evidence. Words that suggest a stopping or a stasis of movement, and the likeness of seemingly antagonistic words to one another. And so Socrates makes the point, well, in the beginning, when language was first becoming, how was this possible? For us, we learn from other people. Perhaps we ourselves can make up names for things. The question, what names did he learn or discover those things from? After all, the first names had not yet been given. It's a difficult question at this level, this sort of fundamental level. What names did he learn or discover those things from? Meaning, if we have an object or a thing in front of us, what can we learn from that object about the expression of our speech? If we think of a painting, certainly we can think of a painter that's representing something that's in front of him. We can also imagine a painter that is representing a concept. Perhaps it's something that he's seen, perhaps not. Perhaps it's something that he's deduced through a variety of different things that he has seen. There are no shortage of these paintings either. Cratylus says you have a point there, Socrates. So if things cannot be learned except from their names, how can we possibly claim that the name givers or rule setters had knowledge before any names had been given for them to know? Cratylus says, I think the truest account of the matter, Socrates, is that a more than human power gave the first names to things, so that they are necessarily correct. Cratylus has a lot of faith in his assumption about the fundamentals of things. He would rather not believe that it is possible that our language rests so loosely on a thing as convention. Although certainly it has a basis in reality, certainly the names that we use represent real things. But in the absence, in the worst case scenario, if people were to succumb to confusion, and nothing really made sense to one another anymore, the convention broke down, the agreement dissipated, what then would be left of the language that we use if we don't have some physical tethering to this reality? While there may be some, perhaps the linguists will hold it, but the vast majority would not. The lack of this ability to reason themselves into language and naming of things seems to be a frightening thought to Cratylus. Socrates says, in your view, then, is the name giver contradicted himself, even though he's either a daemon or a god? Or do you think that we were talking nonsense just now? He says, but one of the two apparently contradictory groups of names that we distinguished aren't names at all. Socrates says, which one, Cratylus? Those which point to rest or those which point to motion? As we said just now, this cannot be settled by majority vote. Cratylus said, no, that wouldn't be right, Socrates. But since there's a civil war among names, with some claiming that they are like the truth and others claiming that they are, how then are we to judge between them, and what are we to start from? We can't start from other different names because there are none. No, it's clear we'll have to look for something other than names, something that will make plain to us, without using names, which of these two kinds of names are the true ones. That is to say, the ones that express the truth about the things that are. Cratylus, I think so too. But if that's right, Cratylus, then it seems it must be possible to learn about the things that are independently of names. Cratylus says, evidently. Now this is something that we have discussed also, about the danger of just using names to orient us to reality, because it's one aspect. Our auditory expression, our auditory sense, is but one of the many things that we can use, the many tools that we have. Moreover than just the tools that we have, which may be fundamental to the higher processing, because we have to have inputs of information to make sense of anything. We can be severely limited in terms of our inputs and still function as human beings, but we don't exist purely as a self and a void. We exist within a physical world, a material world. In this material world, we are tethered to. Now we can bring the sort of divine to it, but there is this affordance between our nature and our reality to that of perhaps the individual, the observer. Not sure I quite like that phrase, but the thing that seems to, the conscious part of us, that seems to be at times independent of this tethering to the material world. And perhaps this is a problem more of the postmodern man than it is of the ancient peoples. Perhaps they were more connected to the world in those days, I'm not sure. But certainly these days we do have no shortage of things that tempt us away from the physical reality. We have many material affordances in our modern society, and it makes us think and see things differently. And it's interesting to mention that there is a civil war among names, some claiming that they are like the truth. Now I would hold that position insofar as they are like the truth, and as Socrates has said before, if a name completely is to describe the thing that is, then it would be the thing that is. But it's impossible for it to do so, for a name is but a name, and it's limited by its craft, let's say. Then this gets into the possibility of multiple perspectives. Multiple perspectives are required for discovering the different aspects of the object. And it's impossible, really, for a name to reduce all of the possible aspects into one central point. It must be general enough to capture the character of the thing without sacrificing its nature, but also surrendering the totality of what the thing is. Now others claim that they are, and in some sense they are, the truth, because they describe fundamental characteristics about a thing, which make it separate from other things. So by its very nature there must be truth in the name, otherwise it would not distinguish that thing from others. And I think both of these statements are partial. I think they require each other. That is to say, they are images of the reality, because they can't encompass all of it. But they do encompass some of it. And so this affordance between the unseen and enough of what can be seen to identify it, I think is the key. But how exactly does this relate to the rules, or the name setter, the rule giver, whatever? And how does this relate to the fundamental view of this reality that their language seems to be based upon, this motion, and its possible misconception? I'm not quite sure. He says, how then are we to judge between them? And what are we to start from? We can't start from other different names because there are none. And that's true. It's certainly a principled way of thinking, of finding things that are more and more fundamental. But at a certain point you have to make the decision. You have to make the sacrifice. And you have to do. You have to produce that word. It will be imperfect and we have to be comfortable living with it. And what we are sacrificing is in some sense the truth. The absolute. Moreover, from that we are sacrificing hubris. An overinflated self-confidence that we can come to know what this is. But the irony is that we sacrifice this so that we may have the truth. We recognize our finite nature so we can experience things that are finite. So that we don't fall into the various delusions of mind. He says, no, it's clear we'll have to look for something other than names, something that will make plain to us, without using names, which these two kind of names are the true ones. Which of these two kinds of names are the true ones? That is to say, the ones that express the truth about the things that are. I think so too, says Cratylus. But if that's right, Cratylus, then it seems it must be possible to learn about the things that are independently of names. And surely it is. We see things, we feel things, we process this information, and then we can produce a sound that might represent what that thing is. It's really not until a thing produces a noise that then we take in that information, and perhaps we choose to represent that visually. Perhaps there's a thing that's multi-aspectual, like we were saying, that has this visual component, a sound component, just as an animal does. And we must describe it, yet still. It's not just language that we can use. Language is very good, though, because within this format, we can use auditory inputs to represent, as long as we understand the convention, what these inputs mean, we can highlight a vast array of our reality within words. If I say red, it's not as though I am producing a red object in front of one's vision. I'm not capturing the essence of red. But everybody understands for the most part. Obviously there are certain conceptions for the colorblind people, but we won't consider them for the moment. That when I say red, and if I'm to say, find something red in your nearest surroundings, you would be able to do so. You'd be able to take a picture of it, perhaps on your phone, and then send it to me. And indeed, it would be red. And the language, fine, based on convention. Perhaps some of the elemental characteristics, some of the letters are more conducive to what the nature of red is. It seems as though it might, but who knows? I've been calling red for that color for all of my life. Perhaps there's a pattern in there that just sort of makes sense to call it red phonetically. But it captures its visual quality within it. It's more than just the auditory thing. I mean, what sound does red produce? Perhaps we can think ourselves into something, represent that on a painting. Red is often considered to be anger, It's an interesting sort of thing to associate a color with an emotion. Red with pain. That sort of makes more sense to us, though, because it is grounded in some natural thing, because the color of our blood is red, and we don't really see it until we are penetrated by something. It breaks our skin, it breaks the protective barrier, it causes pain. And so, pain, anger, this makes sense. This certainly makes sense. Cratylus says, evidently. How else would you expect to learn about them? How else than in the most legitimate and natural way, namely, learning them through one another, if they are somehow akin, and through themselves? For something different, something that was other than they, wouldn't signify them, but something different, something other. Cratylus says, that seems true to me. Now, when Socrates says, how else than in the most legitimate and natural way, namely learning them through one another, if they are somehow akin, and through themselves. Now he's referring to the things here, the things that are. Now he could also be referring to names here. But he also said in a previous statement that it seems it must be possible to learn about the things that are independently of names. And so if we were to imagine for a moment that this statement has nothing to do with names, and we are concerned about the ways we can learn about the truth of the things that are independently of names, then if we take a few things that are and compare them to one another, see how they're different and see how they're similar, we can come to certain conclusions. We can determine what they are not. We can also determine what they are relative to the object that we compare it to. And Socrates says just that. For something different, something that was other than they, wouldn't signify them, but something different and something other. And Cratylus says, that seems true to me. Socrates, but wait a minute. Haven't we often agreed that if names are well given, they are like the things they name, and so are likeness of them? Cratylus says, yes. So if it's really the case that one can learn about things through names, and that one can also learn about them through themselves, which would be better and clearer way to learn about them? Is it better to learn from the likeness, both whether it is itself is a good likeness and also the truth it is a likeness of? Or is it better to learn from the truth, both the truth itself and also whether the likeness of it is properly made? Cratylus says, I think it is certainly better to learn from the truth. Socrates, how to learn and make discoveries about the things that are is probably too large a topic for you and me, but we should be content to have agreed that it is far better to investigate them and learn about them through themselves than to do so through their names. Evidently so, Socrates. Still, let's investigate one further issue, so as to avoid being deceived by the fact that so many of these names seem to lean in the same direction, as we will be if, as seems to me to be the case, the name givers really did give them in the belief that everything is always moving and flowing. And as it happens, things aren't really that way at all, but the name givers themselves have fallen into a kind of vortex and are whirled around in it, dragging us with them. Consider, Cratylus, a question that I, for my part, often dream about. Are we, Or aren't we to say that there is a beautiful itself and a good itself, and the same for each one of these things that are? Cratylus says, I think we are, Socrates. Let's not investigate whether a particular face or something of that sort is beautiful then, or whether all such things seem to be flowing. But let's ask this instead. Are we to say that the beautiful itself is always such as it is? Cratylus says absolutely. So I'd like to begin by thinking about what was said here with a reflection about the experience of Socrates, because we understand that he was put to death for his views and his opinions. And after reading this, I certainly can see how disruptive some of this might be to the way of things in the society. For he's saying, we recognize that much of our language today is based on this conception that has been filtered through the more ancient society, ancient relative to Socrates' day. And through that filter, a name was then given. Now Socrates says, well, perhaps this filter may have been incorrect. Things aren't really that way at all. And if that is to be true, then what are we to say? Man still observes objects. He is still concerned about the way that things are. And so perhaps that's what we should go after. Not necessarily emotion, but the way that things are, purely as themselves. And if we filter the thing that is, if we have an effective filter to observe objects and to determine the things about them that make them, those objects, as distinct from others, then we can truly determine what is true about them, and thereby, assumingly, appropriately name them. And so this is why he says, let's not investigate particular things. We could take a particular face, and just as we have discussed before, we can get lost in the aspectual. Or as John Vervaeke says, the combinatorially explosiveness of the thing or of the face. There are many different ways of seeing this beautiful structure, some of which may not be universal between the opinions of man. And yet, if there is to be a thing such as beauty, there must be a center. There must be some natural characteristics around that I would say that build up that thing that is, that man can dance around to identify. So the question, are we to say that the beautiful itself is always such as it is the perfect question. Because if we are to say yes, then we are to understand that there is a possible center. There's a center for us to tether ourselves to true beauty. Now the conversation there, I think, is the birth of a very productive and fruitful culture to determine exactly what that is. But to deny it, and to get stuck in the relativism, to get stuck in the aspectual, I think, is to lose a type of cohesiveness and interconnectedness, not only with the thing that is in question, but also the relationship between individuals within a society. Socrates says, but if it is always passing away, can we correctly say of it first that it is, and then that it is such and such? Or, at the very instant we are speaking, isn't it inevitably and immediately becoming a different thing, and altering and no longer being as it was? Cratylus says it is. So this is a rather confusing statement here. So let's take it line by line. But if it is always passing away, so it could be the thing, it could be the object, it can be the beautiful. So let's say, but if the beautiful is always passing away, can we correctly say of it, can we correctly say of the beautiful, first, that the beautiful is this, and then that it is such and such, or this and that? Now, if it is always passing away, we have a sort of idea of motion. Right? If we are to try and nail down the state, perhaps, of a river, its form, it would be quite difficult to nail that completely. We can take an image and say this is what it is. Given enough time, the river will change, based on the volume of water, its flow, the amount of rainfall, which would be volume of water, but it would also influence the landscape that surrounds it. Or, at the very instant we are speaking, isn't it inevitably and immediately becoming a different thing, and altering and no longer being as it was? Now, Cratylus says it is. And so it makes it difficult to exactly determine what this thing is. Then if it never stays the same, how can it be something? After all, if it ever stays the same, it clearly isn't changed. At least, not during that time. And if it always stays the same, and is always the same thing, so that it never departs from its own form, how can it ever change or move? Cratylus says there's no way. Then again, it can't even be known to anyone, for at the very instant the knower to be approaches, what he is approaching is becoming a different thing, or a different character, so that he can't yet come to know either what sort of thing it is, or what it is like. Surely, no kind of knowledge is knowledge of what isn't in any way. Cratylus says, that's right. So what can be said about this here? Then again, it can't even be known by anyone. He says, for at the very instant the knower to be approaches, what he is approaching is becoming a different thing, of a different character. Now it's difficult here, because he could be thinking about two different types of things. What is the beautiful is a bit different than what is the coin that sits in front of me. Now it's interesting. And Socrates says, then if it never stays the same, how can it be something? And this would seem to imply that there is something about the sameness, something about its consistency, its constant existence within nature that allows it to be something, the thing that is separate from something else. And so if something is continually passing away, perhaps like a river, how can we call it a thing? Perhaps a river is not a good example. The beautiful is an example, but it is difficult. Because we can say, at one moment, at a particular time, that what is beautiful about a painting has to do with the story that it tells. What is beautiful about it could be within the image itself, the detail that it expresses, the vibrancy of its colors, the various shades. We could also say that it is not a beautiful thing. It is a simple thing created by a simple creature. It is something now, after a few hundred years have passed, that means something different than it did back in the day when it was created. It doesn't strike the same chord. It doesn't resonate the way that it did. And therefore its meaning, and perhaps its universality, in terms of the beauty that it expresses, has now changed. Now the painting is an easy example, yet that there are many other things that can be described here. But I think that perhaps it's not entirely correct to say that if something is continually passing away, that is truly passing away, and that there's absolutely nothing that we can hang on to because of its motion. I certainly think that there are aspects that are to be held on to. Now, it's difficult to hold on to them. I think of some of the writings by the early founding fathers, and if you were to quiz me on the specifics of their writings, I would probably not be able to pass that quiz. But I would be able to tell you the things that stuck with me, that have made me a better man. And I think that the way that they described liberty, the way that they went about understanding freedom, at least in part, they understood it as a spirit that flowed through us, it flowed through our societies. And at different ages and different eras, it appears to be different. For at one time, conditions were such that that spirit was seen in such a way, and then we make a change, and then we are liberated from a certain constraint that does not allow for the full appreciation of what is beautiful, let's say. And then, perhaps, either we fall into a new state of blindness, or it is the case that our ancient, perhaps not ancient is not the right word, but our initial conception of what the totality of freedom and liberty is incomplete. And we have to go back to the drawing board, and now there is something more than just what we saw then. There is another aspect that is fundamental to the nature of the thing that is liberty, that now we must introduce to our lives and to our governing bodies and to our societies. That doesn't mean that the old has passed away. I think that there are fundamental things about that snapshot in time, just as there are fundamental things about the new aspects of liberty. But the problem is, again, this aspectual dilemma. Not every aspect will be available to us at all times. It's like perhaps the point of a moon as it revolves around the Earth. We can't see all of its aspects. Certainly we can't see all of the aspects of the Earth at one time as they are. We can see snapshots of how the Earth is as it is. But we are stuck within a framework. We are stuck within time. And I think what Socrates is trying to imagine here is a place of seeing and of viewing that is beyond the constraints of our reality that allows us to see all the aspects of the thing. And I think that this is more of a divine type of intelligence. This is not the intelligence of man. It's not to say that we cannot appreciate or imagine all the possible aspects, but to experience them all at once, I don't think it's possible. But it is possible to appreciate that they exist. So Socrates says, indeed, it isn't even reasonable to say that there is such a thing as knowledge, Cratylus, if all things are passing on and none remain. For if that thing itself, knowledge, did not pass on from being knowledge, then knowledge would always remain, and there would be such a thing as knowledge. On the other hand, if the very form of knowledge passed on from being knowledge, the instant it passed on into a different form than that of knowledge, there would be no knowledge. And if it were always passing on, there would always be no knowledge. Hence, on this account, no one can know anything, and nothing could be known either. But if there is always that which knows, and that which is known, if there are such things as the beautiful, the good, and each one of these things, of the things that are, it doesn't appear to me that these things can be at all like flowings or motions, as we were saying just now they were. So whether I'm right about these things or whether the truth lies with Cratylus and many others isn't an easy matter to investigate, but surely no one with any understanding will commit himself or the cultivation of his soul to names, or trust them and their givers to the point of firmly stating that he knows something, condemning both himself and the things that are to be totally unsound, like leaky sinks, or believe that the things are exactly like people with thorny noses, or that all things are afflicted with colds and drip over everything. It's certainly possible that things are that way, Cratylus, but it is also possible that they are not. So you must investigate them courageously and thoroughly, and not accept anything easily. You are still young and in your prime after all. Then after you've investigated them, if you happen to discover the truth, you can share it with me. Now Cratylus says, I'll do that. But I assure you, Socrates, that I have already investigated them, and have taken a lot of trouble over the matter, and things seem to me to be very much more as Heraclitus says they are. Then Socrates says, instruct me about it another time, Cratylus, after you get back. But now go off into the country, as you were planning to do, and Hermogenes here will see you on your way. Cratylus says, I'll do that, Socrates, but I hope that you will also continue to think about these matters yourself. Now the footnote here after Socrates says, instruct me about it another time, Cratylus, after you get back, but now go off into the country, as you were planning to do, and Hermogenes here will see you on your way. The footnote says, quote, see on your way, end quote, as a good son of Hermes, who conducts the souls of the dead to Hades, would do. Hermogenes is thus correctly named after all. So at the end, Socrates sort of makes his statement that he doesn't agree about this flowing in motion of things. I have to admit that I myself didn't quite understand the initial discussion about this flowing in motion of things. I tried my best to articulate it in a way that makes sense to me, but I'm glad to see that Socrates has come to a conclusion that for knowledge to exist, perhaps it doesn't agree with the, as he says, it doesn't appear to me that these things can be at all like flowings or motions, as we were saying just now they were. So, whether I'm right about these things, or whether the truth lies with Heraclitus and many others, it isn't an easy matter to investigate. He also admits that, but if there is always that which knows, and that which is known, if there are such things as the beautiful, the good, and each one of the things that are, it doesn't appear to me that these things can be at all like flowing things, right? So that's the beginning of that statement. And so there is an admission, a statement by Socrates that there is a constancy in the universe, perhaps outside of the universe, that makes the universe in such a way that allows for these things to exist. That it's not just nothingness, that there is an order and a direction. Now this order is such that there may be motion within it, but that it allows for something to be recognized and intelligible, to be known, to be seen. And of course, what's interesting is that we end with some irony, and that Socrates gives the correct meaning, uses Hermogenes' name in the correct way as Cratylus would like it to be used. And it's a matter of context in which it makes it right, at least in the eyes of Cratylus. So a very interesting dialogue overall. I think there are some good insights here. We've come to discussions about the arguments of relativism, subjectivity, objectivity, the grounding of things, the pillar of truth that things surround, the nature of things, the fundamental or first principles, the thinking behind language, and the limitations thereof. We spoke of convention, and how this convention, perhaps since the majority of our language seems to be by this sort of convention, and also based on the rule setters who established this convention, which whatever they chose to revolve things around may not be correct. Nonetheless, it doesn't mean that the language cannot be used for other purposes. As we have seen, it can change over time into demean different things. But ultimately, though, names are not the best way to determine the nature of things. It can help assist us, no doubt. But there must be other approaches to learn the truth of things. And certainly there must be a truth of things, and things must have a certain constancy within them to be known at all. And this is the view of Socrates. He says, but surely no one with any understanding will commit himself to the cultivation of his soul, to names, or trust them, or their givers to the point of firmly standing that he knows something, condemning both himself and the things that are to be totally unsound, like leaky sinks, or believe that things are exactly like people with runny noses, or that all things are afflicted with colds and drip over everything. It's certainly possible that things are that way, Cratylus, but it is also possible that they are not. And so this is where it ends. Again, a good discussion. Conclusive in some ways, inconclusive in others. So we will continue next time with Theaetetus, the next Platonic dialogue that seems, as first view, to be discussing what is knowledge, or epistemology.